Okay, so today we're going to dive into this really fascinating economic puzzle that seems to break all the rules. It's called the Hayekian Welfare State, and it's a concept that helps explain how some of the world's most successful countries manage to have both massive governments and thriving free market economies. I know, it sounds totally impossible, right? So let's get into it and see how they pull it off. We're always told there's this big choice to make. You can either have a large welfare state with high taxes, or you can have economic freedom and prosperity. The conventional wisdom says you just can't have both. But what if that's a false choice? What if some countries have actually figured out a way to get the best of both worlds? So, check this out. On the left, we've got the OECD countries with the most economic freedom. Think New Zealand and Switzerland. And on the right, you've got the countries with the biggest government sectors, like Sweden and Denmark. Now, you'd probably expect the big government group to be lagging way behind, but here's where it gets wild. Look at the numbers. GDP per capita, pretty much the same. Human Development Index, almost identical. In fact, the big government countries actually have lower infant mortality and less inequality. And that, right there, is the central puzzle we're trying to solve. I mean, if high taxes and a huge public sector are supposed to crush an economy, why are these countries doing so well? It really flies in the face of a lot of standard economic thinking. To figure this out, we've got to dig a little deeper into what economic freedom actually is. It turns out economic freedom isn't just one single thing. Researchers actually measure it across 5 key areas. The first one is what we all think of, the size of government. Taxes and spending. But the other 4 are just as critical. Having a strong legal system that protects your property rights, maintaining stable and sound money, being free to trade with other countries, and having smart, sensible regulations. And here is our first major clue to solving this whole thing. When you crunch the numbers, you find something really weird. Countries that score high on, say, the rule of law are also super likely to score high on sound money, free trade, and good regulation. They all tend to move together. But having a small government? That metric is the odd one out. It just doesn't move in lockstep with the others. So what this all boils down to is pretty huge. When economists looked at what really drives prosperity, they found that the strength of your institutions, things like the rule of law and property rights, that's what really matters. In fact, one study found that these institutional factors alone could explain 93% of the differences in economic freedom. The actual fiscal size of the government, well, it just isn't the main character in the story of what makes a country rich. And this is where the brilliant economist F.A. Hayek comes into the picture. His work gives us the key to finally unlock this puzzle. Hayek was really skeptical of central planning, not just for the usual reasons, but because of a much deeper problem he called the knowledge problem. So what is the knowledge problem? It's a simple but incredibly powerful idea. It's that no central planner, no matter how brilliant or well-meaning, can ever know all the little bits of information needed to run a modern economy. That knowledge about your personal skills, my preferences, the local conditions on the ground, it's scattered across millions of people and it's changing all the time. Trying to manage that from the top, Hayek argued, is just doomed to fail. And this distinction is the absolute key to cracking our puzzle. We have to start thinking about government size in 2 totally different ways. First, there's fiscal size. That's the one we always talk about, just taxes and spending. But then there's Hayekian size. That's about how much scattered, complex knowledge a government program needs to work. And here's the trick. A government can be fiscally massive, but if it's designed the right way, it can be small in a Hayekian sense. In fact, we can sort government programs into 4 buckets using these 2 ideas. Type B programs, for instance, don't cost a lot, but they require the government to pick winners, a classic knowledge problem. Type D programs, like trying to micromanage the whole economy, need tons of money and impossible amounts of knowledge. But look at Type C. These are programs that are fiscally large, but they need very little central knowledge. Think about things like unemployment benefits. They follow simple automatic rules. No planner has to know every little detail. This is the sweet spot. Okay, this is all a bit theoretical, right? So let's make it real. Let's take a look at an actual country, Sweden. It's famous for its huge welfare state, but its path to success was not a straight line. It was really a story of trial, some very big errors, and most importantly, learning. So for about 25 years, starting back in 1970, Sweden went all in on these knowledge-heavy, top-down policies. They tried to centrally manage everything, subsidize specific industries, fine-tune the whole economy, and it led to stagnation and crisis. But then, they learned from their mistakes. The 1990s became this massive turning point, where they started reforming their welfare state to be smarter, more adaptable, and way less reliant on a central plan.
And their pension reform is the perfect example of this shift. The old system was a classic high Hayekian size program. The government promised everyone a specific payout instead of fixed retirement age. To do that, they had to predict things like life expectancy and economic growth decades into the future, an impossible task. The new system, on the other hand, is a defined contribution plan. It's still fiscally enormous, but it's tiny in a Hayekian sense. So instead of some government committee trying to guess when everyone should retire, the new system just lets individuals choose, based on their own health, their own finances, and their own preferences. It uses the scattered, decentralized knowledge of the people themselves to create a system that's automatically more stable and sustainable. It's a huge government program that runs on individual choice, not on central command. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Is the answer just for every country to go out and copy Sweden's pension system? Well, the research suggests the real lesson is actually much, much deeper than that. It turns out a successful Hayekian welfare state isn't built on a specific shopping list of policies. It's built on a foundation of three underlying characteristics. First, you need high state capacity, a government that's actually competent and effective. Second, you need the ability to learn from your mistakes, to experiment and fix things when they go wrong. And third, you need to favor smart design, programs that are low on that Hayekian knowledge scale. But wait, where did those things even come from? Well, they rest on an even deeper foundation. And that foundation is made of two key ingredients that are completely intertwined: that high state capacity we just mentioned, and high levels of social trust. People have to trust each other, and they have to trust their institutions for any of this to work. That trust makes compromise and big, long-term reforms possible. And this brings us to a really crucial warning. Just because some countries can pull off this mix of a large public sector and economic freedom doesn't mean all countries can. If you try to build a massive welfare state without that bedrock of social trust and government competence, it can be a recipe for disaster. You can end up with corruption, inefficiency, and economic decline. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. When we look at these successful countries, it's so tempting to just ask which policies we should copy-paste. But maybe that's the wrong question entirely. Perhaps the real challenge, the much harder and more important work, isn't about finding the perfect policy blueprint. Maybe it's about building the deep social trust and the institutional capacity that allows a society to experiment, to learn, and to adapt over time. Now that's something to think about.